All right, in this session, we are going to talk broadly about the storyline from Abraham in Genesis 12 through the end of the book of Genesis. So what we're going to do is pick up on a theme that runs through the entire book. And once you kind of see how this theme works, you'll be able to go and work through this yourself. We won't be able to pick up, obviously, on every nuance and everything, but this is going to be a big one, and this one will really illustrate what it is like to read biblical narrative. So we are in the stories narrative portion of the book of Genesis, and this is what we have. As the story of Abraham begins, we have a promise that has been given to Abraham that he will become the father of a nation and his descendants will be as numerous as the stars in the sky and the sand on the beach. But as we saw at the end of last time, as grand and as great as that promise is, and this is the theme that we're going to draw out of this entire storyline from Genesis 12 to Genesis 50, as great as that theme is, and as great as the promise of the covenant is, there is always a challenge to this. I mean, it's like every single challenge that comes around has the potential of crashing this promise of God and just bringing it to a swift end. So let's see how this works out. Abraham and Sarah have been called later in life, and so they have made their journey from Ur and Haran to the Promised Land. They get there, there's been a famine, they go down to Egypt, they come back, years go by, and this promise, as Abraham and Sarah are getting much older now, this promise of having a son simply has not happened. So Sarah finally says to Abraham, I think it's pretty much apparent that we're not going to have a son, but we have a servant, house servant, Hagar. Why don't you go and have a son by her? Maybe that's the son that we are to have. So Abraham doesn't seem to blink at this at all. He goes and he and Hagar have a son. That son is Ishmael. Now, after Ishmael is born, this plan kind of turns sour to Sarah, and she wants to get rid of him and so forth. And so mother and son, Hagar and Ishmael, go off. God reveals himself, says, go back, submit yourself to the household. And she does. Another 14 years goes by, and Abraham and Sarah receive word, heavenly kind of visitation thing, that in fact she is going to become pregnant. So, sure enough, within the year, she is pregnant and she gives birth to Isaac. Now, when Isaac is born, this kind of brings back around this relationship of Ishmael and Isaac, and so Sarah again sees that Ishmael, being 14 years older than Isaac, she sees all the dynamic that's happening. She doesn't like this, and so she's going to, she and Abraham are going to ask Hagar and Ishmael to leave again. But a promise is given to Hagar about Ishmael that he too will be a great nation, and so off they go into the wilderness, leaving Isaac. So after all of these years, Abraham being 100 years old, after all these years, finally the Son of Promise has come and God has delivered, and the covenant, the hope of the covenant being able to be carried on is alive. However, of all things, you just can't see these things coming. God speaks to Abraham and tells him to take Isaac on a journey 3 days away to a mountain, and to build an altar there, to put wood on the altar, and then to put a sacrifice on the wood. So off they go, Abraham and his son Isaac, and as the journey comes to the end at the mountain, Abraham and Isaac go up to the mountain. What Abraham knows, or has been revealed to him, is that his son, his only son, Isaac, is to be the sacrifice. Isaac does not know this, and they build the altar, they put the wood on the altar, and then Isaac says, all right, where is the sacrifice that goes on the wood? And Abraham reveals to Isaac that he is going to be the sacrifice. So Isaac is placed on the altar. Abraham takes his knife. He is one single moment away from plunging that knife through his son, and thereby, for all practical purposes, bringing an end to the promise of God, as far as Abraham would know. So, just the blink of moment before Abraham thrust the knife through Isaac, there is the revelation of God, and God stops the whole thing, and there's a ram caught nearby in the thicket, and the ram is placed on the offering. So you get the story, but the significance, the theological significance of this story is not only in the high drama, which is affiliated with the story, waiting so long for there to be a birth, and then now with this one son, and the entire promise of God hangs on the shoulders of this one son, having to turn that son, in a sense, back to God, or having to sacrifice that son, and the incredible faith with which Abraham engaged this entire episode is absolutely amazing. But right from the beginning, with the story of Abraham and Sarah, you can see that the fact that Sarah cannot have children, and yet this grand promise has been given to them, just unfolds itself into a story that is just remarkable. And Abraham, Hagar, Ishmael, years go by, Isaac comes, years go by, and of all things, if God doesn't ask Abraham to offer as a sacrifice his son Isaac. So you see the threat to the promise, to the covenant that God has made. So we are through the first generation of that story, and then as Isaac grows older, and it is time for him to marry, Isaac ends up marrying Rebekah. And of all things, the same exact theme, the same exact kind of circumstances that were true of Sarah earlier, that she could not have children, that she was barren, is now true of Rebekah. She cannot have children, and she too is barren. So in this second generation, there is the resurfacing of, it looks like the promise is good to go. It will be continued through Isaac, except for this one thing. Now his wife will not be able to have children. So as time goes on and Rebekah prays, God hears that prayer. But when she becomes pregnant, as you could probably foresee, things are not at all going to be simple and easy and straightforward in these stories. Of all things, Rebekah has, at the same time, 2 sons in her womb. Jacob and Esau. Now, even before they are born, the story in a dramatic fashion kind of depicts this high-tension relationship between Jacob and Esau, and we get the image that these 2 sons are they're already fighting it out even pre-birth. And Rebekah not only has 2 contentious sons that she is carrying, in fact, she has 2 nations that she will be the mother of. So, again, we have a very high-power, dramatic kind of story. She has not been able to have children. God hears her prayer, and rather than just making it simple and clean and easy, and she is the mother of 1 son, she is the mother of twins. The truth is, although I put Jacob and Esau in that order, the truth is that Esau was born first, and then Jacob was born. And as Jacob was being born, his hand was grasping the heel of Esau as if to symbolize an attempt to pull Esau back into the womb and Jacob be born first. So Esau is in fact the first, and it should be fairly clear in this story that Esau will be the one through whom the promise of God will be continued, and so he will have the traditional things that you would expect for a firstborn son. He will have the birthright and the blessing. So it should be fairly straightforward how this story of God is going to go, and how the covenant is going to yet make its way through another generation. And all of that would certainly be fine and good if it weren't for this one thing. Jacob and Esau were exceptionally different kinds of people. Esau was an outdoorsman. He was adventurous. He was a hunter. Jacob was kind of a home guy, enjoyed staying around the household. Very different in their personalities, very different in their style. And it so happened that Rebekah and Isaac had an affinity, each one of them, for a different son. So Rebekah kind of had an identity, or an affinity, I should say, for Jacob, and Isaac had something of an affinity for Esau. So as the years go by, we have a couple of stories in which both Esau's birthright and blessing end up in Jacob's hands. And in one of the stories, Esau has been out hunting. He comes back, he's very hungry. Jacob has made some soup. And Esau thinks that he's going to die anyway, and he just so very much in his hunger wants the soup. So Jacob asks him for his birthright, he gets it. In the second one, again, Esau is out hunting because Isaac is nearing his death. And Isaac wants one of his great meals that he loved so very much that Esau could prepare. So Esau is out doing his thing. And Rebekah is aware that when Esau comes back, that Isaac will enjoy this beautiful meal and that he will bestow the blessing upon Esau. And so Rebekah intervenes in the story, alerts Jacob as to what is happening, concocts a plan in which they go out and Jacob finds a couple of goats and she kind of makes the dinner that Isaac is expecting. And Esau being a very hairy man and Jacob being more of a smooth skin kind of man, they take the goat hair, they place it significantly on places on Jacob's body. And so Jacob goes to his father Isaac in his old age. Isaac cannot see well at all, is nearly blind, and he offers him the food. And then he asks for, that is, Jacob asks for the blessing. And Isaac, thinking that this was Esau that had come in, and Esau that had prepared the food, and Esau that he was blessing, Isaac ends up unwittingly blessing Jacob. So Jacob has managed to wrestle in a couple of very different ways, or managed to gain from Esau a birthright and a blessing. So in this story, we now have the promise of God. It will be continued on. It will go on to the next generation. But just the drama, high drama again, that is associated with this story. First of all, that Rebekah cannot have children, and then when she does, she ends up with twins. She's doubly pregnant, and of all things, it is not Esau, the first child that was born, but Jacob that ends up with the birthright and the blessing. And so the story will continue on through Jacob rather than through Esau. So now we have come down to the second generation, and the storyline, the story of God's promise and God's covenant will continue on with Rebekah, Isaac, and now through Rachel. Jacob's wife is Rachel, and that has itself been a very twisting and turning of the story because of what happened between Jacob and Esau. As Jacob was just receiving the blessing from his father Isaac, it's almost as if he left the room. Esau walked in and he has prepared the meal that he has, and then it all comes to light. The deception that that Isaac has been subject to. So Jacob has little choice actually but to just leave the premises. So he packs up his stuff, he runs off, and he's going to go and stay with his mother's brother. So he will be with Laban, his uncle, while he's there. And he gets to know Laban's two daughters, one of which he very much loves, and that is Rachel. Laban kind of uses this as a business opportunity. And so he says, I'll tell you what, here's the deal. If you'll work for me 7 years, you can have my daughter Rachel. And Jacob does so with great delight. The 7 years pass quickly for him. He does an incredible job in managing the livestock, and things are prosperous, and he's doing well. And then at the conclusion of the 7 years, he is prepared to take Rachel as his wife. However, Rachel has a sister and Jacob was not very much attracted to Leah, but she was the older sister. And of all things, Jacob ends up consummating the marriage. He himself now has been tricked. In the past, he's been the one who's kind of pulled off a hat trick. Now, he is the one who is tricked by Laban, his uncle. And when he thinks he is consummating his marriage with Rachel, in fact, he ends up consummating his marriage with Leah. And so all of that comes to light, and the deal is that Laban is willing to offer Rachel to Jacob, but in order for him to do that, Jacob is going to be required to work yet another 7 years to have the opportunity to have Rachel as his wife. So Jacob works an extra or another 7 years, and Rachel becomes his wife. So you can see already that this story is it's just building up for complexity, and with all that has happened so far, you could probably see that there's about to be a lot more drama unfold here. And so here it comes. Jacob is very much in love with Rachel. And they desire to have family, to have children. And so when the time comes for them to have children, of all things, Rachel cannot have children. She is barren. And this sounds just like, does it not, this story of Sarah before her and of Rebecca, and now we see this theme for the very third time in this third generation happening, of all things, to Rachel. But while it is the case that Rachel cannot have children, Leah is very productive. She can almost have children at will. So Leah has 4 children, 4 boys. Rachel is understandably hurt, jealous, and they each have their servants. And so Rachel does something that maybe she got out of the playbook of Sarah. Rachel says, I'll tell you what, I have a servant. And so she suggests to Jacob that he have children by her servant, and Jacob in fact does, and there are 2 more children born to the servant of Rachel. Leah gets into the action by saying, well, okay, I see how you're going to play this game. And so Leah then, with her servant, and Jacob has 2 more sons. And then, as if that were not enough to heap upon the heart of Rachel, Leah herself had 2 more sons. So, if you're following the math, 4, 6, 8, 10 sons have been born to Jacob, and not a single one of them is a son of Rachel. Finally, God hears Rachel's prayer, and Rachel becomes pregnant. And the son of that pregnancy is Joseph. And what a beautiful, what an incredible story this could shape up to be. That after 10 sons being born, Rachel finally, God blesses her, she is finally able to become a mother, to bear a son, and Joseph is born. And as if it couldn't become better, Rachel becomes pregnant again. And Benjamin is born. But in the high drama of how these stories are unfolding, as Rachel is giving birth to Benjamin, she loses her life tragically. Benjamin survives, but Jacob has lost the love of his life. Benjamin has lost his mother, and she is buried, of all things, by the way, in the town of Bethlehem. So, the story just could not get more interesting. We have 12 sons, and of those 12 sons, the favorite of Jacob is going to be Joseph. The first son was Reuben. Joseph is number 11. And Jacob is going to show favoritism toward Joseph. And there will be several stories in which it is really clear that Jacob's heart is really with Joseph, and he's kind of set him apart. He makes for him this beautiful multicolored coat. On a couple of occasions, Jacob sends Joseph to check on the brothers, and one of them, Joseph, is 17 years old. He checks on the brothers. A couple things happen. He shares with them this dream that he has that indicates that his brothers and his mother and father-in-law are going to bow down to him. That kind of, as you can imagine, that kind of ticks the brothers off, and it even kind of seems to set back his father just a little bit, that, you know, he would have this kind of dream, or he would talk about this kind of dream. So his brothers are really on the out with him. They just have little like for Joseph. Joseph, on one of the reports that he brings back to his father, gives a bad report about the brothers and so forth. So there's really this growing tension of the brothers and how they see Joseph, and clearly see the favoritism that has been bestowed upon him. So on one of the occasions in which Joseph was sent out, the brothers see him coming, and they are going to make a plan to try to just be rid of Joseph. At first, their intention is they would kill him, and then they decide that's probably not a great idea. As they are out doing their work, they see a caravan that is going down to Egypt, and they decide that they would, rather than kill him, that they would sell him off to the caravan. Joseph would ride off, never be heard from again, undoubtedly, be lost somewhere in the land of Egypt forever and ever. They would take his coat, they would kill an animal, they would dip his coat in blood, and having done all of that, they would go back to their father Jacob and say, look, we are so sorry to bring you this news, but here is that coat for Joseph that you made. We found this. You can see by the blood stains and markings on it. Joseph was attacked by a wild animal and is dead. So, just an unbelievable kind of storyline develops out of this. And just as a side story, Genesis adds a story, and when you read it, most people probably wonder, why is this story even in here? But there is a story about Judah that will, something of an odd placement story, but it will be a story that will help us to see how all of this will play out in just a few moments. So Joseph has been sold off. One of his brothers, Judah, the fourth brother, has 3 sons. So Judah and his 3 sons, the oldest son marries a young woman named Tamar, and the son dies, and in the culture of that day, she would become then the wife of the second son. So Tamar becomes wife to Judah's second son. The son dies, and then finally Tamar would become the wife of Judah's third son, except for this one thing. By the time that it came down to the third son, Judah was not willing to honor and bless that marriage, and he just saw Tamar as bad news, that the 2 sons that she was married to, their lives were ended, however it came about, and Judah didn't want that to happen again. So he did not allow Tamar to be married to the third son. As time went on, Judah's wife dies. He goes off. Sometime after her passing, Judah has gone to market to take the sheep for shearing, and he's coming back, and he notices on the side of the road that there's a little business going on that he had never noticed before, and it just so happens that he is interested, little prostitution kind of action going on, and Judah is interested, except that he doesn't have money to pay for all of this, so he simply says to the woman who is presenting her services, perhaps we can strike a deal here. I can give you my staff and my cord and my ring, and then when I get back home, I'll send a servant back out. He'll pay you off and you can return the items. All is good and fair. A deal is struck. And Judah goes. He goes, when he gets home and he sends the money back, the servant can't find where all of this took place. He can't find the woman. The business is gone. It just evaporated. It's just not there. Some months later, there is a knock at the door at Judah's house with the report that Tamar has been seen pregnant. Judah sees this as the opportunity to pretty much get her out of the story, because if she's now pregnant, then he will no longer be obligated to fulfill this thing of her being married to his third and final son. So he brings her in. Judah brings Tamar in, asks a few questions, and just couldn't help it. He asks her who the father of the child is. When he does so, Tamar presents to him the staff, the cord, and the ring of Judah. And so this story, with its oddity and just real bend and twist to it, where now of all things, the very Judah who would not allow Tamar to be married to his third son, Judah has now impregnated his daughter-in-law, Tamar. So ultimately she will have sons. But the story is there, and as you're reading along through this and you're kind of following the Joseph story, this story kind of might appear to you to be an interruption, or you might just say, well, that was interesting, and you just try to wonder, why is that story told? Well, hold on to it just for a moment. We'll get back to the Joseph story, then we'll resolve this. So Joseph goes down into Egypt. He is an interpreter of dreams, and he ends up in Potiphar's house, who is second in command, and he is serving well and so forth. And of all things, Potiphar's wife takes interest in Joseph. And Joseph wants to have no part of it, and so she pursues relationship with him. He, in a very direct way one day, and he flees from that. She grabs this garment, and when Potiphar comes home, she frames Joseph, sets it all up as if Joseph had made an advance toward her in some way. Joseph is placed in prison. God blesses him, however, while he is in prison. And eventually, Pharaoh's own baker and cupbearer end up in prison. They have dreams, and Joseph is able to interpret those dreams. The cupbearer returns to service. The baker loses his life. And then years go on, and then of all things, Pharaoh himself has a very disturbing dream, a couple of dreams. One of which is that he sees 7 well-grown and mature cows, and then 7 very lean cows, and the lean cows eat the mature, well-fed cows. And Pharaoh is so very much disturbed about this. He brings in all of the people that he has access to, and they cannot interpret this dream. And then finally the cupbearer says, I remember that when I was in jail, there was Joseph, and he seemed to be able to interpret dreams. So they bring Joseph in. Joseph interprets the dream, and that interpretation is that there are going to be 7 years of prosperity and 7 years of the land producing, followed by 7 years of famine. So Joseph is placed now at second command in the nation, and he is going to manage this whole thing of the grain, being able to store through those first 7 years of prosperity so that during the next 7 years of famine, people in Egypt will have plenty to eat. So Joseph does this. He manages it beautifully. The famine comes. As part of that famine, the land of Canaan is impacted, and Jacob sends his 10 of the sons into Egypt, because the word is out that Egypt has bountiful grain in this time of famine. So 10 of the sons go down there. They encounter Joseph. Joseph is able to identify that these are his brothers, but his brothers do not know who he is. And so he fills their bags with grain and sends them back home. And along with that, there's just other things that are added to the story. Like he puts their money back into the grain bag, and that's going to make things complicated. They come back. When they need more grain, they bring the money back. They have also been requested to bring their brother back, their youngest brother, Benjamin. All of that happens, and Joseph sees them. They still do not know who he is. And as the story is a beautiful story, as the story unfolds, Joseph throws a great feast for all of them, and ultimately he reveals himself to them. So when he reveals himself to them, as you can imagine, the brothers, Joseph has been just overwhelmed with this. The brothers themselves are somewhat, as you can imagine, terror-stricken. And yet Joseph embraces them, and they love on each other, and their brotherhood is kind of reunited. And so he asks them to go back to get Jacob and to bring him back to live permanently with them in the land of Egypt. So you can imagine this story unfolding, and ultimately all the brothers are back together again, and their father Jacob is with them, and they are settled and well taken care of in the land of Egypt. Now, all of that really sets up the fact that this whole storyline of the promise of God, okay, it's where we started, that's where we'll end up here. This whole promise of God has seemed to really go into some tough valleys, to face some great challenges, and now you've got Joseph, who is in a very prominent place, and God has just worked through all of that. The family is back together again, and it seems so natural that in this particular story that the covenant promises and this messianic line certainly and undoubtedly would flow right through Joseph. I mean, I think that's pretty clear in how all of this happened. Even though the first son of Jacob through Leah was Reuben. Towards the end of the book of Genesis, before Jacob dies, he gathers his sons together and he blesses each of them. And it would probably be interesting to see, in fact, how this unfolds, because of all things, this is the blessing that is given to Judah. Judah, your brothers will praise you. Your hand will be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's sons will bow down to you. You are a lion's cub, Judah. You return from the prey, my son. Like a lion he crouches and lies down, like a lioness who dares to rouse him. The scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until he to whom it belongs shall come and the obedience of the nations shall be his. He will tether his donkey to a vine, his colt to the choicest branch. He will wash his garments in wine, his robes in the blood of grapes. His eyes will be darker than wine, his teeth whiter than milk. This really sounds like to me the right words, but the wrong son. The brothers would bow down to him. He would rule. This is certainly, how could this not be the blessing bestowed upon Joseph? It's just the way the stories actually and naturally come to this place. But this was not the blessing that was given to Joseph. This was the blessing that was given to Judah, the fourth son, the son of Jacob, who himself had 3 sons and a daughter-in-law named Tamar. And this is the one who denied Tamar the privilege and the right of having an inheritance through the 3rd son. This is also the one who ended up unwittingly being the father of the children that Tamar would bear. This is the one through whom the lineage, through whom the blessing of the coming Messiah would actually find fulfillment. I just look at these stories and how could you have ever seen that coming? This was obviously set up from day one. This was just set up to be a story where Joseph would be the one through whom the promise of God is delivered and through whom this covenant is transferred. So here we are at the end of Genesis. And as you read the stories of Genesis, you can start going back to them and keep an eye on the covenant and the promise of God. Look at all the ways, and all we did was pick up on the theme that people like Sarah and Rebecca and Rachel were barren and were not able to have children, and how ultimately they were to have children and what happened to those children, and how the covenant and the promises nearly came to a screeching halt in some of those situations. And that's just one part of this larger story. When you go back through the stories, start thinking in terms of other threats that you see arising throughout these stories. But now at the end, we have this incredible, dramatic, unpredictable story of God. And remember, although we've talked a lot about, these mothers and the sons that they produced and just a handful of their stories, the ultimate hero, the ultimate focus of the stories is God himself. And go back through the book of Genesis. Look at these stories, watch what God is doing, how he does it, and perhaps you'll come away with the sense, or at least I come away with, right when you think the story's going to end, or the promise cannot be furthered, or right when you think, I I have this figured out now. This is going to be about Joseph. This has been beautiful, and I can see how God was working this whole thing toward Joseph. Right when you think it all makes sense, right when you think you have God figured out, right when you think you know exactly what he's going to do, well, here you go. So, I hope that you will just have a marvelous time walking through narratives, seeing how they work, picking up on these theological themes, watching the story of God unfold throughout these stories. And as you do so, you'll just see so many beautiful, refreshing, enlightening things about God. So, enjoy your journey, enjoy your own pilgrimage through the book of Genesis, and may God bless you as you encounter these stories in a fresh way.